Welcome back to Eigen Designs. Today we'll be making a farmhouse end table out of construction grade lumber. The total cost of lumber for this particular project was $32. I built this to prove that you can have beautiful furniture in your home without spending a fortune on exotic hardwoods. And for those people who are trying to build a woodworking business, this is a great high margin item that can help grow your business. So let's go. Today I want to build a farmhouse end table out of construction grade lumber. So I've got a sketch here where we're going to have some crosses on the side of the table. It's going to sit about 2 feet high. And then this bottom area right here will have some slats across it, so you can actually use it for some storage and some shelving down here. This is going to be an antique white color, and then the tabletop itself is going to be more of a darker, rich stain. So normally I do furniture work with hardwood. Today we're going to be doing it with softer wood. I'm going to be using pine. So here's the lumber that I'm going to be using. We've got some 2x4s, and then we've got some 1x6. Both of these are southern pine. For step one of this process, I'm going to be taking these 2x4s through the thickness planer. Now you're getting a really good look at the lumber that I picked up from the hardware store. I probably had to go through 30 2x4s to get one that was this straight without any major defects in the lumber itself. But I'm going to run it through the thickness planer just to get rid of these rounded edges, because that makes it look like construction lumber, which it is. And then I'm going to start making the cuts to make that design. For the 1x6, I'm going to cut this into 3 strips, 3 slats, maybe 4, and glue them up and actually have that be a solid piece before I go to stain it. I'm intentionally trying to keep the cost down on this build, so I'll be using 3 2x4s, which are about $6 a piece in my area, and 2 1x6s, which are about $7 in my area. So the total cost of lumber for me will be about $32, and I'll be using some leftover paints and stains and poly from other projects to keep the cost down. I'll be breaking this project up into 2 main parts, the tabletop and the legs. I'm starting with the tabletop because the finishing process has a lot of drying time with the polyurethane, so I'm going to go ahead and get a jump start on that. So I cut up the 1x6s to start making up the actual tabletop piece that'll stain later. Next thing I'm going to have to do before I start gluing this up is run these joints through the jointer, because right now there's some pretty significant gaps. Even though I ran the edges through the table saw only mirrors the shape of the board. So this obviously has a little bit of a bow or a twist into the board, and that's creating this gap right here. So what I'm gonna do is take out my desktop jointer that I've got. I'm gonna turn these 2 joints face down and run them through the jointer together. That way this seam, this right here, will become a mirror image of itself, and it'll close that gap. It's kind of incredible how that works, but that's what I'm going to do next. I always check my jointer for square before I run anything through it, because I'm constantly moving it. So you see me here using a square just to make sure that everything is exactly 90 degrees. I take time to run every single pair of joints together through the joiner to make sure that the seams are perfect whenever I go for the glue up. This process can be a little bit tedious, but I promise you it's worth the time invested to make sure that your final product doesn't have any gaps. For the glue up, I'll be using Titebond 1 and my 52-inch bar clamps. I'd like to use my parallel clamps here, but unfortunately they're only 18 inches long, so they're not big enough to incorporate this piece for the glue up. Because I used the bar clamps rather than the parallel clamps, I did get a little bit of cupping. Something I could have done is taking 2 straight edges on both sides across all of the boards and clamp them down to ensure flatness, but I didn't do this on this build, and I wish I would have. Once the piece was dry, I took a chisel and removed as much of the dried glue as I could prior to sanding. But before I got to that step, I needed to put a nice straight edge on the end of the board, and it was too wide to put through my crosscut sled, so I decided to mark it with a square and then come through with my circular saw and just put a nice clean edge on it. Once I had a nice straight edge to reference against, I then ran that through the table saw and put a clean edge on the other side so it was perfectly square. With the cutting done, I then went over to my downdraft table and just took a 80 grit piece of sandpaper and got most of the glue off of the board. I did this on both sides, and then I worked my way up to 120 grit and then eventually 220 grit on the tabletop. Before staining my tabletop, I took a scrap piece of wood and the 3 different stains I had left over from other projects just to see what it looked like on the wood. Of the 3 colors, I really liked the last color the best because it brought out a lot more richness and made it look like a darker walnut, which I feel resembles more of the farmhouse look than the other colors. So as one last measure, I flipped that scrap piece of wood over and just ran that same stain across the entire piece of wood just to confirm that I liked the color. And everything looked pretty good. So I decided to go with that color and stain the entire tabletop this dark brown walnut color. Once the stain dried, I took the tabletop inside to begin the coating of polyurethane. The polyurethane coats need to go on in thin, light coats, sanding with 220 grit sandpaper in between each coat. What takes so long about the finishing process is just the drying time of the polyurethane, which for the particular brand that I'm using, they recommend 4 hours between coats. So it can be quite time intensive, which is why I wanted to get a start on this before working on the legs of the table. A little tip if you're looking to preserve your brush in between coats, you have to wait about 3 to 4 hours in between coats of polyurethane. And that's long enough for the brush to dry out. So if you take a couple of shop towels or paper towels, fold them on themselves like this, and then take a little bit of mineral spirits and saturate the shop towels. And then take your brush like this and close it, and then put it into a baggie. Whenever you come back to continue the finishing in about 3 or 4 hours, it'll be nice and saturated, it won't be dried out, so you can continue to use the same brush as you do your finish. With the tabletop complete, I turned my attention to the base of the end table. I began by planing the 2x4s that I had just to remove that round over and give it less of a construction look and more of a fine piece of furniture look. I had to make several passes to get that round over edge knocked off. The other way you could have done this is taken it through the table saw, but I would have lost width and I didn't want to do that. Once that everything was planed, I then went over to my miter saw and began cutting all the pieces of wood to length. Not too many cuts for this particular build, and it went pretty quickly. So now comes the part where I assemble them together. I'm going to use a combination of wood glue and pocket holes. And what I'm going to do is put the cleanest side of the wood face down. And then I'll do the same thing with these cross members, because I'm going to make some mark for the pocket holes, which will be facing the inside of the table to be as hidden as possible. I'm just going to use this one as a spacer. Okay, now I've got them marked. I'm going to cut the pocket holes. To help make the pocket holes, I'm using one of the smaller jigs from Craig. I typically don't use a lot of pocket holes with the type of builds that I do, but it seemed like a good application for this particular end table. Okay, got all the pocket holes cut. Now I'm going to get everything relatively aligned right here. And then once this is roughly in place, I'm going to come through and glue and screw. Just applying some Titebond 1. The wood glue is not quite as effective whenever you use it on end grain like this, so this is really a secondary support. But the two together, the pocket holes working in conjunction with the wood glue, makes an effective joint. Once the frame was assembled, I then turned my attention to the bottom rails that are going to be holding the slats that will make up the bottom shelving of the end table. I secured this to the frame using a combination of Titebond 1 wood glue and some brad nails. And you see me here using a sample piece of one of the slats to serve as a spacer. That way it's completely flush with the side of the frame of the end table. Once that was done, I then took the remaining 1x6 material and ripped the slats that will then make up the bottom part of the shelving. Again, I used a combination of Titebond 1 and some brad nails just to secure it in place. To make the crosses on the side of the frame, I first set the table saw to the right height to rip the wood that I would be using for those crosses. I set the fence at the same distance from the blade as the thickness of the wood that's used in the frame of the box. That way it'll be a flush look whenever everything's done. Once I had the long strips, I then placed the strips diagonally over the box and then just took a pencil to trace out where I needed to cut on the miter saw. With the first piece cut, I took it back over to the frame to do a quick dry fit just to make sure that everything was going to line up correctly. I then repeated this process to make the opposing diagonal cross member. Once both pieces were cut, I then put them in place and then took a pencil to trace out where they intersected so that I could make some diagonal cross cuts on my table saw to recess those inside one another. The lower section complete, I then turned my attention to the painting. Now you'll notice that the bottom part of this was already painted before I started using my HVLP sprayer, and that's because I used a brush to get in between each of the slats just to ensure I had complete coverage. The HVLP sprayer that I'm using, it stands for high volume low pressure, and it made really quick work out of this particular project and didn't leave any brush marks behind. For the last and final step, I took the finished tabletop and laid it face down on my workbench and then took the base, once everything had dried, and centered it above the bottom side of the tabletop. I then used some L brackets to screw everything in place because I wanted the flexibility to change out the tabletop if the occasion called for it. It was a little bit awkward getting the right camera angle in to show this particular part of the process, and I ended up going away from the power drill and just using a hand screwdriver because it was a lot easier to maneuver. The final product turned out really well. It looks refined and elegant and doesn't look like it was created from construction grade lumber. An item like this in my area will sell for between $100 to $125. So if your cost of materials is between $30 to $50, this is a very high margin item for you to look at. Alternatively, this would be a great piece for the home. My wife actually wants to not only keep this, but have me build another one to match a set within our living room. I appreciate you sticking around to the end of this video. I hope you were able to learn something or at least get some ideas to go off and do something on your own. If you like this content, please give me a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.